everyone, and welcome back to another episode of TDNY. This day, not year. The podcast that looks back at the history of the week ahead. Join me, your host Adam, as this week we look back at June 2nd to June 8th, and some of the interesting, or easiest to research on a time constraint, history that occurred during these dates. As per usual, we'll end each day with a song pairing for that story, and who knows, you may find a new favourite band. I know I've been blasting a lot of evaporators lately, and we'll also end the episode with a quiz. 7 questions, 1 from each of the 7 stories ahead, just to see if you've been paying attention. And as a teaser for what you'll be paying attention to, on this episode, we'll learn how the seaside city of Portland, Maine became dry, why a seabird came to die, when a suffragette upset a jock-ey, and is modern disco all a lie? Plus a whole lot more along the way. So, let's kick things off with Monday, June 2nd. On this day, not year, a booze-fueled riot is led by a sober mob. Prohibition, the ignoble experiment, as per Britannica.com, is the legal prevention of the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages in the United States. It lasted from 1920 to 1933, and is what helped to sour the reputation of American wine prior to the Judgment of Paris. It also gave rise to a lot of criminal gangs, as suddenly demand for the illegal booze skyrocketed, and it killed many, as now those who couldn't get a drink from fairly regulated brewers had to rely on more sketchy sources. As per a National Geographic article titled "Americans Knew Their Booze Was Poisoned and Drank It Anyway," it's estimated more than 50,000 had died from tainted alcohol. It also saw over 500,000 people convicted, and brought in an estimated $80 million in fines, which one inflation calculator puts at just under $2 billion in 2025. Although $128 million was spent trying to enforce prohibition, so overall a net loss. While all this seems rather negative, it did have some positives too, like reducing overall alcohol-related illness and death. If we exclude the above 50,000, of course. So, why all this prohibition talk today? Well, did you know this wasn't the first time America had run this little experiment? No, this was just the first countrywide ban. Our story today takes place during a statewide prohibition. That lucky state finds us back in the New England area of America, specifically Maine. Our last visit to New England, in episode 19, left us in the dark, as the states were blanketed in a darkness that blocked out the sun. Today, while seasons are sunnier, moods are anything but. Maine, as depicted in many Stephen King books, is a dreary place, full of run-down port towns and listless individuals. Fortunately, the real Maine is also home to some wonderful beaches, nature-filled areas, and other interesting tourist attractions, including Stephen King's old house. The state is the most northeastern area of mainland United States, Canada on one side, New Hampshire on the other, and water surrounding all else. Today finds us in Portland, Maine. While it's not the capital city it once was, that honour falling on the newly named Augusta in 1827, Portland is the most populated within Maine, as a lot of shipping for the New England area entered its shores. The year is 1855, and the last 4 years, since 1851, the state had been under an alcohol prohibition, often called the Maine Law. This Maine Law was put into effect by the Mayor of Portland, a man who earned the nickname the Napoleon of Temperance, a man who allegedly, when chief firefighter, watched a liquor store burn down, rather than, put it out. A man who at 23 years of age started up the Maine Temperance Society, and was then seen as radical when he wanted wine outlawed too. A man named Neil Dow. In his memoirs, Neil recounts Maine as a state of drunks, recalling that stores offered alcohol to passerbys. Many of these places kept rum punch constantly prepared in a tub, sometimes on the sidewalk. That the priests, when on house calls, would often leave full of more spirit than which they had entered with. And that in Maine, it was as much the rule to quit work at 11 in the forenoon and 4 in the afternoon to drink, while in Portland, 11 o'clock was sounded by the town bell ringer to notify all of the hour for drink. And drinkers had their fair choice, at least as of 1828, 23 years before Maine law started. There was one licensed bar for every 45 people in the city. So, when Neil ran for mayor in 1851, and won the gig, he was set on introducing prohibition, and it was passed within a month. Maine now had 2 weeks to offload their current stock, and would then become a dry state. While this went over well with a few, mostly the upper classes, who had been part of the Temperance Society from the get-go, it didn't go over well with the lower classes of the state, nor with the Irish. Irish immigrants had flocked to Maine, fleeing Ireland, as mentioned in episode 17. Between the years of 1845 to 1852, it's estimated nearly 1 million Irish died from hunger or direct effects from the lack of nutrients, while an estimated 2 million fled the country, packing ships and hoping to reach distant shores before they perished. Not only had many of the current Maine Irish immigrants just directly escaped from starving to death, now they couldn't even raise a glass in a toast to life. Perhaps asking in their anachronistic best Jack Sparrow, "Why's the rum gone?" So, when Neil was back for re-election in 1852, he lost, blaming it on the illegal immigrant voters. Some things never change, do they? But the law still stood, and by 1855, Neil was back with a vengeance, getting back into office after a very narrow win. And a new amendment introduced May 1855 read, "If an expressman, cartman, porter, or any other person shall carry a bottle, or cask, or demijohn of wine, or other liquors, to a gentleman's residence, he is subject to a fine of $20. So no Uber delivery then. It goes on, "If any man carries in his own baggage, or about his person, a flask, or any other vessel containing liquor of any sort to be used by him, the party doing so is made liable to a fine of $30 and 30 days imprisonment." A writer for the New York Times commenting, "No sensible man can believe that such an enactment as this can keep its place permanently. It will inevitably create a reaction which will not stop with remedying the evils that provoke it." Then, in an act Boris Johnson would recognise all these decades later, Neil would do something very stupid. As per the Portland Guardian and Norman B. General Advisor paper, a large quantity of spirituous liquors had been purchased in New York and brought here, Portland, for sale. Our mayor, the Napoleon of Temperance, had purchased himself around $1,600 worth of spirits and stored it at City Hall. While this had been done for the purpose of using the spirits as medicinal supplies, word got around that he was looking to profit from the sales, and that he had also bypassed his own rules, the Maine law, in buying and storing the alcohol. It turned out he had too, signing for the alcohol in his own name, rather than the city, and neglecting to have it supervised, made it illegal. And after a tip-off, a judge ordered a search warrant and demanded it seized. Neil Dow, too, should have been seized by the law, but wasn't arrested. Can you imagine such a time when those in office weren't held accountable for their crimes? On June 2nd, 1855, exactly 4 years to the day since Maine law had gone into effect, a crowd started to gather outside City Hall, where the alcohol was being stored, upset at their mayor for skirting the law that had been hindering them these past 4 years. Initial estimates put the crowd at around 200, but in an attempt to drive them off, Neil started ringing the bells of City Hall, which only led to more people gathering around. Soon an estimated 1,000 to 3,000 had gathered, and young kids had begun pelting the occasional brick or other missile at the hall, breaking windows and pounding on the door. The crowd grew beyond what the local police could deal with, and Neil called in the militia, ordering them to fire upon the crowd. Here the story diverges a little, source depending, so we'll draw what happens next from an 1855 cable reprinted in newspapers around Australia. As per their report, Neil called on the militia to fire, but it was an order they thankfully didn't obey. Instead, they escorted Neil away, as the crowd grew angrier after learning they had been told to be fired upon. The barrage of missiles grew, and soon police began firing blank rounds, hoping to disperse the crowd on their own. This also didn't work. Finally, Neil was back, with a new group of guys with guns. Captain Charles Roberts, Rifle Guard of the Light Guard Armory. More trigger-happy, when Neil ordered fire this time, they did just so, muskets levelled at the crowd of 3,000. One man, a George Robbins, the report reads, was shot through the body and almost instantly killed. The ball entered his right side, between the 5th and 6th ribs, passed through his body, cutting off the great aorta, and escaped. Although the only casualty, he wasn't the only injury. One in the crowd had a musket ball pass through his chin and exit the cheek. Another, their tibia shattered, eventually requiring amputation, while some others escaped with grazes, flesh wounds, or general bruises from the crowd. One man, it is said, just walking home for the evening, found a new hole passing through his hat when he next examined it. This act of violence finally dispersed the crowd, and what has since been nicknamed the Portland Rum Riot came to an end. It also signalled the end for Neil Dow. While he stayed on as mayor after the riot, his popularity plummeted. The next election saw him stepping down. The following year, in 1856, Maine law, or prohibition, was repealed. As of 2016, Maine was ranked 5th in America for number of breweries, and as of 2025, has over 170 active breweries producing alcohol. Perhaps not a pairing for during Prohibition, but I'm sure the message found in Lagerstein's song, Drink the Rum, was one imbibed by many in 1856 after the Maine law was no more. Tuesday, June 3rd. On this day, not year, a bird species fails in flight or fight. Let's play a little guessing game to start this Tuesday off. What bird am I describing here? This black and white, flightless bird is an excellent swimmer, but quite ungainly on land with their webbed feet. It chooses remote, rocky areas, surrounded by ocean as breeding grounds. For the most part, they are monogamous, staying with one partner at a time. An adult standing, on average, around 80 centimetres or 31 inches tall. So, any guesses so far? Okay, if all that hasn't given it away, perhaps this final clue will. The bird's Latin name, Pinguinus impennis. Pinguinus impennis. Of course, we are talking about the great auk. That's A-U-K, auk. What? Penguin? No, dear listener. The great auk was the original here. Pinguis, meaning plump, fat or oil, while impennis for flightless, while their more common name of penguin is thought to come from a Welsh origin, pen gwyn, meaning white head, a name later reused for the penguins we are more familiar with today when they were discovered. Although they share much, name and appearance, the birds are only distantly related. The great auk coming from the Alcidae family, while penguins are found in the Spenhicidae family. I can understand some confusion, however, as I was playing quite dirty in my description, using a lot of present tense, when, sadly, in reality, it should all be past tense. The great auk has gone much the way of the dodo, I'm afraid, and many other animals before it. That is to say, extinct. Great auks, when alive, were found around the North Atlantic Ocean, around the northeastern edge of America, and the rocky shores and islands of Greenland and Iceland, all the way to Europe. Ancient cave paintings even being found of the birds in France, which the New York Times accidentally reported as Antarctica-based penguins, much to the disgrace of one reader, writing in, "You report on the discovery of prehistoric cave paintings, then seem to show penguins, a group of birds that occur only in the southern hemisphere? Much more likely is that they are of the extinct great auk, a flightless North Atlantic seabird." For centuries, the birds had been eaten by humans. Fossil evidence dating back some 100,000 years showing they were popular on the prehistoric plate. Unfortunately for the birds, humans didn't remain stationary over those 100,000 years, as we built up sailing routes, international trade, etc., all driven by ships. The age of sail. These ships needed food, and unfortunately for the great auk, when on land they were no competition for a hungry human. As per nhm.org, one story goes that in just half an hour, hundreds of auks were herded onto a single ship for use as food on a long journey. The great auk was a bit of a wonder bird, it seems. People prized their meat, their large dappled eggs, Their feathers and down, even the fats and oils of the bird had a place in trade. Unfortunately, unlike the chicken, the great auk wasn't much of an egg layer, producing just one a year. Between their dwindling population due to human fashion and diets, they also came under threat from rats, carried on ships, noshing on their eggs during their breeding seasons of May to June. The population plummeted so low that by the early 1800s they were more of an urban legend than a common sighting. French-American painter John James Audubon was one of the leading experts in drawing birds. That's the feathered variety, not a Titanic French girl situation, in the early to mid-1800s. He published, in 1838, a book titled The Birds of America that contains paintings of 435 birds, including several that have since become extinct. The Carolina parakeet, the passenger pigeon, and, of course, the great auk. Only John had never actually seen a living great auk. When he set out to find one to paint in 1833, they had become so scarce that none could be found in situ. The painter had to rely on a taxidermied great auk for his work. Supposedly, only 80 such works of taxidermied great auks exist still today, while up to the 1900s only 51 eggs had been kept by collectors. Finally, the last straw, or perhaps the last feather, fell on June 3rd, 1844, although other sources claim July 3rd too. The bird scarcity had become its own downfall. As their numbers became fewer and fewer, the amount collectors were willing to pay went ever higher. Eldey Island is a small little rock outcropping 13 kilometres, or 7 miles, off the shore of Iceland. For centuries, such islands had been the ancestral breeding grounds for thousands of great auks. But on this day, back in 1844, just 2 remained. A male, a female, and their lone egg. Although alone as a species, they weren't alone on the island. John Branson, Sigjor Islifun, and Kettle Kettleson had been contracted out to retrieve great auk samples by a client who was paying for bodies. The 2 birds were cornered, caught, and strangled. Their egg scrambled in the chaos. While on the way to deliver their bodies to their client, they met another buyer and sold them off for £9. How's that? An entire species killed off for under a tenner. Matuzo123's review of Eldey Island on Google Maps sums the entire thing up quite well. This is where the last great auk has died. 1 star. From the 1963 movie, loosely based on Elvis Presley being drafted into the army, my song pairing for this story is the titular song Bye Bye Birdie, sung by Ann-Margret. Wednesday, June 4th. On this day, not year, it was one small step for women's rights and a final stand for a woman. 1913, the first 4-engine plane took flight. Cars were being assembled on moving assembly lines for the first time. Stainless steel was just created, and the crossword puzzle was published. All of this, and yet women in the United Kingdom couldn't do something as simple as voting. Although it's not right to say they couldn't do it, and more, they weren't allowed. The equity between genders was far from balanced, favouring men heavily, which some women weren't going to take lying down. The suffrage movement wasn't one unique to the United Kingdom, but the UK's history with it dates back to the 1800s. The gender divide was still massive, but until the Great Reform Act of 1832, female house owners had been allowed to vote. A small minority of the gender, sure, but this changed when the Act specified that only men were allowed to vote. Over the coming decades, the suffrage movement attempted to get local MPs to pass private bills correcting this, but these were rare to succeed and required a lot of active lobbying from the movement. By the 1900s, attention to and coverage of the suffrage movement was drying up. That is, until the WSPU, Women's Social and Political Union, headed by the trio of mother and daughters Pankhurst, took a more active approach in fighting for equality. Members of this branch were referred to as suffragettes. We've already heard of one act a suffragette has caused in this podcast. If you can remember back to episode 13, and the Stoon of Scone, that was housed in Westminster Abbey atop the coronation chair. On June 11th, 1914, a bomb planted by the suffragette movement exploded nearby, possibly a cause for splitting the stone in two. This was a common tactic of the militant WSPU arm of the suffrage movement. Attention to the cause by any means. Well, that said, most of their more extreme targets weren't designed to take a life or cause any undue suffering for the ordinary person. But that's not to say people weren't injured, however. If they were around today, they would probably be labelled domestic terrorists, with such acts as smashing windows, burning down letterboxes, and marches on Parliament ending in fights with police. Christabel Pankhurst was quoted as saying, "If men use explosives and bombs for their own purposes, they call it war, and the throwing of a bomb that destroys other people is then described as a glorious and heroic deed. Why should a woman not make use of the same weapons as men?" Which they soon did, as letter bombs, house fires, and bombing campaigns spread across London, targeting members of the government, post offices, public transport, banks, any significant infrastructure or building they could get at, really. The suffragettes were done playing nice for equality, and were keeping the cause at the forefront of the media and the public's minds. Between 1913 to 1914, they had carried out over 300 attempted or successful bombing and arson attacks. At the heart of this movement was a woman who participated in many of these more militant campaigns, Emily Wilding Davison. Born in London on 11th of October 1872, she grew up, attended school, and later studied literature at college, until she was 21 and her father passed away, and the funds to study dried up. The next 13 years would see her save up money while working as a live-in governess to pay for her college exams, which, although she passed, wasn't awarded a degree, as much like many things back then, they were for men only. She taught at a couple of schools before moving into a tutor role, but by 1906 she had joined up with the WSPU. 3 years later she had quit her job and was now a full-time suffragette. In 1909 she was charged with assault, after suffragettes attempted to storm the House of Commons with a letter for the Premier. They were stopped by police, who were slapped and had their helmets knocked off by umbrellas. Emily was sent to prison for a month. She was joined the following day by more suffragettes, including a 94-year-old, after they had attempted to storm the Prime Minister. A hunger strike saw her released early, and once out, she continued her attention-grabbing actions, breaking windows at political meetings, throwing stones at politicians' cars, more hunger strikes busted up by a fire hose that saw her sue the jail and win, breaking and entering, and arson. She was a woman possessed, a mindset that drove her to the edge of destruction on more than one occasion. She was quoted as saying, "In my mind is the thought that some desperate protest must be made to put a stop to the hideous torture which is now being our lot. One big tragedy may save many others." Unfortunately, June 4th, 1913, that big tragedy occurred. The Epsom Derby, a 2,423-metre, or about a 1.5-mile horse race, that had been run on the first Saturday of June since 1780. This year, one of the horses running was King George V's horse, Ann-Margret. Emily was the only suffragette at the race that day. She had propaganda hidden away beneath her clothing, and carefully positioned herself in the spectators, so that her actions would appear on camera. What actions, you may be wondering? Well, as they were recorded on that day, you can go on YouTube and search for any combination of Emily Davison Epsom Derby to see the video yourself. As the horses round the bend, Emily waits for most to pass, steps out from the crowd onto the track, and into the path of Ann-Margret, the king's horse. They collide, and all three, Emily, horse, and jockey, fall down. Two would go on to make a full recovery. One would never again regain consciousness. Nobody is entirely certain what her goal was. Some believe she was holding a suffragette scarf that she was attempting to place onto the horse. Others think it may have been a letter of demand to the king. Either way, she went down and would die 4 days later. The king and queen, in attendance, witnessed the event. The king later calling it most unfortunate, while the queen, a lady born into royalty, with want for nothing, wrote that Emily was a horrid woman. Emily's funeral procession saw a line of 4,000 to 5,000 mourners take to the streets of London. As even more stood vigil over the procession, heads bowed, a reporter describing them as hushed, awed, and looking a little bewildered. There were even signs of dawning understanding. Despite the criticisms many had levelled at the militant ways of the WSPU and the suffragettes, the death of Emily seemed to silence much of that, if only for a day. The following year, World War I broke out, and as a show of respect, the WSPU halted all militant action. After the war, the government finally made concessions, and on the 10th of January 1918, women over the age of 30 were declared legally able to vote. Not a level playing field still, but definitely a step towards it. Another movie song for my pairing to this story. Originally, the song didn't appear in the movie, and it was only due to a misunderstanding, the actress thinking she had been cast as a lead role, when instead it had gone to another. Wanting to quash any embarrassment on both sides, Walt Disney told Glynis Johns that a new song had been written just for her. A song the two writers had to quickly pen before the end of the meeting to help sell the lie. That song turned into Sister Suffragette, from the movie Mary Poppins, sung by Glynis Johns. Thursday, June 5th. On this day, not year, The ship was cruisin' for a bruisin'. Before we start, here's a question for you, the listener. Are you more of an early bird or a night owl? Lock in your answers now. It will decide whether you would have survived this story or not. But first, some background. Count Alexander Vasilovich Suvorov-Remenitsky, nicknamed the Sword of Russia, or God of War, was a Russian general in the mid-1700s. Of the 56 battles he participated in or directed from 1758 to 1799, 54 were victories, 1 was a withdrawal, and 1 was kind of a tie. He was just about Gilbert and Sullivan's model of a modern major general, except with modern military knowledge to boot. As per Wikipedia, he was well versed in mathematics, history, and geography. Spoke German, French, Italian, Polish, Turkish, Arabic, and Finnish. He also had a thorough knowledge of philosophy, ancient and modern literature. His military erudition was impressive. Impressive. Ah, got it. If you would glimpse his resume, you'd say it was excessive. Some G and S aside, it's no wonder that over the years Alexander had been honoured by using his namesake. One such example is the Soviet cruiser Alexander Suvorov, which was a 13,600-ton warship launched in 1952. Although it never saw any reported action, the 210-metre or 689 feet long ship was a common sight patrolling the waters until it was scrapped in 1991. Outside of war, his namesake was also used to christen a river cruise ship. Again, the Alexander Suvorov. This Alexander was launched in 1981, was 135 metres, or 442 feet long, 4 decks tall, and contained such luxuries as an onboard theatre room that apparently doubled as a function hall, complete with a retractable roof, multiple restaurants, a bar, and even a dance floor. Rooms came with private bathrooms and air conditioners, and the ship apparently even had its own souvenir kiosk. It sailed the Russian River Volga, Europe's longest river. It's this ship that is to be the star of our story today, although perhaps more a fading star than one shining brightly. 2 years after its launch, in 1983, it was on a journey from Rostov-on-Don to Moscow, a 1,000-kilometre trip by land, and as per justgorussia.co.uk, which offers a modern-day cruise between the two, it's a 12-day journey along the river. The ship was reportedly carrying 330 passengers, with 65 crew and staff. Although reports state the ship could carry up to 468 passengers, and anecdotally it wasn't uncommon for stowaways in the form of crew family members to be aboard also. A little over halfway into the journey, June 5th, the cruise ship had reached the city of Ulyanovsk. Present day, the city has 2 large bridges spanning across the Volga River, a railway bridge, known as the Imperial Bridge, capable of carrying heavy freight trains, was built between 1912 and 1916, while the President Bridge started construction 3 years after our story today, only opening in 2009. It was just before 10 p.m., and the ship was travelling at its top speed of 25 kilometres, or 16 miles per hour, around the river bend and towards the bridge. Passengers on board had gathered in the theatre room, either for an auction or to watch a movie, or possibly both, sources vary. And the top deck was soon crowded with hundreds of passengers, looking for some late-night entertainment. The ship carried on towards the bridge. Some on the upper deck were lucky, quickly ducking down to the bar below, or back to their room to retrieve an item. Others finding the movie boring and so left early. Many others weren't as lucky. The Imperial Bridge has one section taller than the others, just off-centre, that ships are supposed to pass under. The Alexander Suvorov was pointed nowhere near it. Those on shore could see this and tried to radio the ship. No response. They tried firing flares. Nothing. They reportedly even fired a pistol, but still the ship stayed its course. At 10:45 p.m., June 5th, the unstoppable ship met the immovable bridge. The top section of the ship, deckhouse, cinema, dance hall, was sheared off, going from a 4-decked ship to just 3. If you've ever seen the opening to the 2002 movie Ghost Ship, or the climax of the more recent 3-Body Problem, I can only imagine the carnage was similar. But things were about to get even worse. A freight train had been travelling across the bridge at the same time. Maybe this is why the flare and gunshots weren't noticed? We'll never know, as those driving the vessel weren't around after, and the captain had gone downstairs for a nap. As the 6,000-ton ship collided with the bridge, the freight train was thrown off, and cars full of coal toppled onto the boat, crushing those unlucky enough to be beneath, and giving survivors the exfoliation of a lifetime from the tumbling coal, in what is medically called a avulsion. In total, it's estimated that 176 people died in this chaos. Those who had been sleeping below deck woke up to a nightmare as they emerged up the stairs into the carnage. The driver of the freight train, from the bridge above, thought the deck looked like it was covered with a red tablecloth. Hospitals in Ulyanovsk ran out of room, as the city also ran out of coffins. Although Cold War-era Russia was a secretive place, this was such a large disaster that news quickly spread around the world. As per the New York Times, 2 days after the incident, the publicity suggested that the death toll was high, or that the victims might include foreigners who would have to be accounted for. Lesser accidents involving only Soviet citizens are sometimes not reported. Ultimately, and perhaps controversially, the ship's captain was charged over the disaster, despite not being in command at the time and suffering catastrophic injuries during the collision himself. His family suspected the government required someone to be charged, and he was the unlucky one hung out to dry. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was released after 6, dying in 1990. As for the Alexander Suvorov, well, it was recovered, repaired, and put back into service the following year. It still operates today for those looking to book a relaxing cruise down the Volga River. My song pairing for this story is The Song of the Volga Boatmen, as sung by the Red Army Orchestra, a traditional song sung by those who traded down the Volga River, pulling their barges along the water. Friday, June 6th. On this day, not year, China solves a new problem. Last week, if you can remember our story about Wang Gongcheng, you may remember me telling you about China's 4 great inventions: the compass, paper-making, printing, and the star of that story, gunpowder. Well, today I'd like to nominate a 5th invention to that list. Have you ever been fubbed before? Perhaps you're a fubber yourself. You may even be fubbing right now, but that's okay. I give you permission to fub away. What am I going on about? Well, it's a rather new term. A portmanteau combining the words phone and snub. Wiktionary.org defines it as to ignore the conversation around oneself by focusing on one's smartphone. While Dictionary.com offers the following: to ignore a person or one's surroundings while in a social situation by busying oneself with a phone or other mobile device. The word was first coined in 2012, when advertising agency McCann needed a way to term the phenomenon for a campaign they were running for Macquarie Dictionary. Ultimately, it was Adrian Mills, McCann Group Account Director, that came up with the word. It's quite a divisive topic too. Before researching for this story, I had seen a comment online of someone bemoaning being on public transport with everyone on their phones, the poster criticising those who were, with some comments in support, and others stating it's no different from if everyone was holding a book. I didn't know it at the time, but what that commenter was describing was fubbing, although perhaps a more mild version. I can only speak for myself, but a quiet trip on public transport with everyone distracted by their phones is infinitely preferable to the talkative seat neighbour. Fubbing isn't just a dirty word though, and perhaps you've used it to your own advantage once or twice. Imagine this scenario. You're in a shopping mall. The store you need is 50 metres in front of you, but between you and it stands a mall solicitor. Someone trying to sell off shady goods, or sign you up to a charity where the CEO is on a multi-million-dollar salary. You need to pass the person by, and don't want to get suckered into a chat. So, what do you do? Simple. Pull out your phone, pretend to be engrossed in conversation or frantically looking something up as you walk by, shielded by your strategic fub. Which brings us, after some meandering, onto our story for today, public fubbing. It may be something you've witnessed, or you may even be guilty of a public fub yourself, losing track of your surroundings as you're engrossed in your phone while walking around in public. If you're lucky, nothing will happen. Maybe you'll veer slightly off course and need to correct, possibly bumping into someone. But if you're unlucky, the consequences could be a lot worse, really putting the die into dire. As per the study, Effectiveness of Interventions for Mobile Phone Distracted Pedestrians, a systematic review, studies found mobile phone distraction while walking is increasing significantly, and mobile phone use at pedestrian crossings is a growing concern because it contributes to pedestrian-related crashes. This study also states that the number of pedestrians, in the United States at least, requiring hospital treatment after being distracted by phones while crossing a road had doubled from the year 2005 to 2012. While the study on the National Road Safety Partnership Program website, or the nrspp.org.au, states that cell phone using pedestrians are less likely to notice other objects in their environment, even if they are highly salient. And a Monash University study found that in Melbourne, 20% of pedestrians were distracted by smartphones, and of those 20%, 31% of those distracted pedestrians were involved in a safety-critical incident. Which brings us to China, June 6th, 2018. Fubbing isn't just a Western problem, and is prevalent wherever mobile phones are. The rise in phubbing led one city in China, Xi'an, to present an elegant solution: a phub lane. Brightly coloured in red, green and blue, and marked with pictures of phones and instructions, the phub lane, painted along a large shopping mall, was requested by locals to try and bring some safety and order to the street-facing mall. While attempting to research this story, I tried searching for phub, P-H-U-B, hoping to learn more about the etymology. Well, I certainly learned something, all right. Phub, as it turns out, is also short for Pornhub, an adult website, which gives a completely different meaning to the word. The song pairing for this story isn't so much for the story the lyrics tell, or the themes it portrays, but simply for the title alone. My pairing, from Johnny Cash, is I Walk the Line. How do you, the listeners, feel about a phub lane in public areas in your city? Is it something you'd like to see gain more use? Let me know in a comment. Saturday, June 9th. On this day, not year, patient 0 of a new fever is identified. Symptoms of this fever include full-bodied movements, from jerking hips to strutting, finger-pointing, spinning, and a proclivity towards tight-fitting, light-coloured clothing. The name of this particular illness? Saturday Night Fever. Perhaps best defined by the Internet Movie Database as anxious about his future after high school, a 19-year-old Italian-American from Brooklyn tries to escape the harsh reality of his bleak family life by dominating the dance floor at the local disco. Yes, if that hadn't totally spelled it out, I am talking about the 1977 John Travolta-led movie Saturday Night Fever. The effect this movie had on the disco genre, pop culture, and music in general can't be understated. History.com stating, "Disco as an all-consuming cultural phenomenon might never have happened without the 1977 film." The New York Times writing, "In 1978, every city in the world seemed to have its industrious John Travolta clones, young men with little to hope for but a dazzling sense of style." While other movies, like Flying High or Airplane, depending where you are in the world, parodied a scene from the movie 3 years later. The soundtrack for Saturday Night Fever, laden with Bee Gees hits and other high-energy singles, became a worldwide success, taking out #1 spots on the American albums and singles charts, and reaching #1 across the world too, from Australia to Japan, Norway, Portugal, Spain, and too many other countries to start listing them off one by one. While the movie, despite its R rating, took in more than $25 million in the first 24 days after its release. As of 2024, the box office gross is at $673 million. Not bad considering it only cost around $4 million to make. All of this wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for one article, titled Tribal Rights of the New Saturday Night. Published in the New York Magazine in 1976, it was the sole inspiration for the movie. Written by British journalist Nick Cohn shortly after arriving in New York. The article follows Vincent, describing him as third-generation Brooklyn Italian, 5'9" in platform shoes. During the week, Vincent sold paint in a housewares store. All day, every day, he stood behind a counter and grinned. It wasn't just platform shoes that made Vincent Vincent. The article details his wardrobe. 14 floral shirts, 5 suits, 8 pairs of shoes, 3 overcoats. Continuing on, everybody knew him. When Saturday night came around and he walked into 2001 Odyssey, all the other faces automatically fell back before him, cleared a space for him to float in, right at the very center of the dance floor. 2001 Odyssey was a franchise of disco nightclubs, first opening in 1972, and quickly gaining prominence as some of the best clubs. The article explains further, Odyssey was their home, their haven. It was the place, the only disco in all of Bay Ridge that truly counted. It was a true sanctuary. Once inside, the faces were unreachable. Nothing could molest them. They were no longer the oppressed, wretched teen menials who must take orders, toe the line. Here they took command. They reigned. A face, that's capital F, ace, is described in the article as a kind of celebrity within the disco scene. The elite, the best of the best. Vincent was a face, as was Tony, John Travolta's character in Saturday Night Fever. You can probably see the similarities if you've ever seen the movie. Without this article, there would be no movie. It was essentially the script. There was just one problem. Much like Janet Cook in episode 14, it turns out this entire story was made up. Nick revealed in 1996 that the article had been a work of fiction, saying years later, "It reads to me as obvious fiction, albeit based on observation and some knowledge of disco culture." The character of Vincent in the article, the face, had been a combination of someone he grew up with in Ireland and a person he knew from England, meaning the character of Tony in Saturday Night Fever was based on fiction. The influence the movie had over the genre and the disco scene in the following years were all fraudulent. Even the soundtrack to the movie was somewhat false. Originally consisting of era-appropriate disco music, the Bee Gees, a very white, non-disco band at the time, were brought in to redo the soundtrack prior to release. Disco isn't just dead, it was murdered, and John Travolta wore its body as a suit. But I could just be jive talking. The Bee Gees, the biggest contributor to the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, came from the UK, as did the inspiration for the character described in the article that inspired the movie. Therefore, I feel it's only a fitting pairing to stay in England, and what could be more English than the Wurzels, with their fitting song, Farmer Jonesie's Travelling Disco Show. Sunday, June 8th. On this day, not year. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Yes. Ever since the invention of the plane, birds have been enemy number one. Orville and Wilbur Wright took their first flight in 1903 in the Wright Flyer. Just 2 years later, September of 1905, a flock of birds intercepted Wilbur on a flight. While Wright was all right, as was the plane, one of the birds wasn't coming home to nest. Then, in 1911, owing to an open cockpit, a French pilot was swooped at and harassed by an eagle. The retort of a pistol shot was the only thing able to deter the bird, flying away unharmed after. The bird, that is. As planes became more powerful and more advanced, the risk of a bird strike became more deadly. The first casualty occurred in 1912, when another Wright plane struck a flock of birds. the body of a seagull lodged in the external steering mechanisms, forcing the plane into a nosedive, and the pilot, Calbray Rogers, fell to his death. A series of headlines over the years tells the story quite nicely. Planes menaced by bird strikes, July 26, 1947. Bird hazards to aircraft, August 1st, 1961. Bird strike problem under investigation, November 1st, 1964. Or you may even remember the miracle on the Hudson, when pilots Chelsea Sullenberger and Geoffrey Skiles, seemingly against all odds, landed their Airbus A320 and all 150 passengers safely on the Hudson River. They had to take this river runway as a bird strike had taken out both engines during liftoff. Since 1988 alone, over 200 deaths have been attributed to bird strikes on planes, with the most dangerous times being during takeoff or landing. Even when a plane manages to shrug off an avian altercation, the damage they leave has been estimated as costing the industry $1.2 billion USD globally. One airline, All Nippon Airways, or ANA, decided enough was enough and took matters into their own hands. Fortunately, this isn't a Great Orc situation, with Japan declaring war on birds, wiping out species left and right. No, this was a much lower tech, lower effort answer. On this day in 1988, they painted eyes on their airplanes. As per birdguard.com.au, a website that sells scary eye balloons. One way birds detect predators is by looking for the eyes. When birds see the large, round eyes of scary eyes, their product, they interpret them as the eyes of a predator and become afraid. Claiming this fear response deters birds away from the eyes, which is exactly what ANA hoped would happen. Turns out they had good reason for this hope too. Their test didn't use their entire fleet. Only a few of their planes had the eyes painted around the engines. The planes that didn't, on average, suffered 9 bird strikes over the 1-year trial, while those with the eyes only had 1 strike on average. While airwaysmag.com claims that there is only 1 strike death per billion hours of flight time, I'd still prefer a plane that could look me in the eyes than one that couldn't. Watching you, watching you, watching you. My song pairing to end this story and the week is Private Eyes by Hall & Oates. Which brings us to the quiz. How are you feeling? Confident? Been paying attention? Well, we'll soon see. Question 1 for Monday. Pre-Prohibition in Portland, at what time did the bell ringer cry out for the drinking hour? Question 2 for Tuesday. What island did the last great orc die on? Question 3 for Wednesday. A 1914 suffragette bombing in Westminster Abbey is thought to have been responsible for breaking what in two? Question 4 for Thursday. What was the name of the bridge our ship from this story crashed into? Question 5 for Friday. Fub is a portmanteau combining what 2 words? Question 6 for Saturday. How many floral shirts did the fictional Vincent own? And question 7 for Sunday. How long after the first human flight before a bird strike was recorded? Right, got something down for each of them? If not, go back, play the questions again. But for those who have, here are the answers. Answer 1 for Monday. 11 a.m. was when the bell ringer would cry out for the drink time. Answer 2 for Tuesday. Eldey Island, off the coast of Iceland, is where the last great auk was. Answer 3 for Wednesday. The Stone of Scone, or the Stoon of Scoon. To hear more, refer to episode 13. Answer 4 for Thursday. The Alexander crashed into the Imperial Bridge. Answer 5 for Friday. Fub is a portmanteau of phone and snub. Answer 6 for Saturday. 14 floral shirts, which in my eyes is probably about the right number. And answer 7 for Sunday. The first bird strike was recorded just 2 years after the first human flight. And with that, it brings us to the end of another episode. We've been seeing some good scores on the quiz lately, so hopefully this week is no exception, and if you are playing along, I hope you did alright. If not, always next week. Or listen to an old episode and see how much you've retained from that. So thanks for listening to another episode of This Day Not Year. I hope you've enjoyed yourself and learned a thing or two along the way. If you have any friends, family, or co-workers who you think would enjoy the show, and you're feeling particularly extroverted today, I'd love for you to share the episode with them and help the podcast grow. Failing that, a rate, a comment, and a vote in the quiz results are all things I enjoy seeing too. And on comments, if you need to get in touch with me over any mistakes or for any other reason, I can be reached on thisdaynotyear@gmail.com. Join me again next week as we take a look back at the history of the 9th to the 15th of June. Until then, I hope you have an historic week. Adios.